everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today's video game topic, well, I've got a couple coming this week, but my first video game topic is top-down video games versus the three-quarter view. Sometimes, I can't remember what the other thing they call it. The three-quarter view, you know, oh god, it has a specific name. Versus first-person shooter. Or, excuse me, first-person, not necessarily shooter, but first-person. These are the three primary perspectives that video game designers traditionally used back in the day when technology was primitive. I know, primitive. Holy shit. We've come a long way in 50 years since video games were invented. But this was how they kind of sort of represented a 3D-esque environment. You had either the top-down, which was like Zelda, or your traditional JRPGs like Final Fantasy III, or Chrono Trigger, for those of you fuckers who played that game. No disrespect, although I did just call you a bad word, but I apologize. But I already said it, you've already clicked out the video, so there's nothing I can do about it. I played Chrono Trigger, but I'm moving off of that because I've already harped on it enough. But, you get the point. This was that type of game. And then you have the three-quarter view. Isometric, that's the word they call it. They call it an isometric view. This is not as common, but it did exist. Some examples of an isometric view would be Super Mario RPG, The Legend of the Seven Stars on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. That's an example. Another example would be Sonic 3D Blast on the Sega Genesis and Sega Saturn. That's a terrible example, but it is an example. I mean, it's an acceptable example, but it's a terrible game. Well, it's not an awful game, but it's not a great example. And Toe Jam and Earl, the original one on Sega Genesis, that's kind of sort of an isometric type view. There are a handful of others, but let's be honest. As you can tell, I can't remember them because they weren't notable. You know, there was like Kid Clown, whatever the fuck it was called, and there's a handful of isometric video games. This perspective royally sucks ass, so game developers know better than to use it most of the time. Another example, great game, probably questionable use of the isometric view, Poltergeist, or Haunting starring Poltergeist on the Sega Genesis. Great fucking game. But then technology advanced. You know, we got 3D graphics, etc. And then games moved into the first person. Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, and then, you know, Call of Duty, etc., etc. Halo and whatnot. Which is where video games have more or less resided ever since. Now, I'm not talking about third-person 3D games. We're talking, you know, those would be like Sonic Adventure, Super Mario 64, you know, Donkey Kong 64, or anything on the Nintendo 64, pretty much, made by Rare, usually. Because those are basically isometric games with a rotating camera. So they're still kind of, sort of, I mean, they are proper 3D, but they usually do have a very similar playing field to your isometric game. So, those are kind of in between the pseudo 3D isometric game and the proper 3D. But they are proper 3D environments, but the cameras can rotate, and you can kind of make them isometric or top-down or side-scrolling depending on the camera and how you want to play the game. So those are rotating cameras. That's a whole separate discussion. We're just talking about fixed camera angles. Top-down, isometric, three-quarter view, first person. Because by and large, whichever version of those three games you're playing, for the most part, there are always exceptions. Don't come at me in the comments with your exception, because I know there are exceptions. But there's always exceptions. But by and large, whatever game you're playing, if you're in that particular perspective, it's fixed. More or less. For the entire game. I know Zelda has side-scrolling segments. The original Zelda does have side-scrolling segments, so eat that to people who shit on Zelda 2 for having side-scrolling gameplay as well as top-down, because the original Zelda had side-scrolling, so suck it. But let's get off of that. Alright. Now, I've already made my stance clear. Isometric, boo. Top-down, Diablo does it well. Marvel Legends, X-Men Legends, I should say. Marvel Ultimate Alliance, those games did it well. Zelda, hit or miss. Some of them are top-down, some of them are full proper 3D, like Mario, like I mentioned. That may or may not have the option to do a pseudo-isometric type view. But then you have first person, so you got games like the aforementioned first-person shooters, and then you got games like it's right here, Metroid Prime as an example, Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, those types of games. Now, even before we went proper 3D, you still had pseudo first-person shooter or first-person type games with like Eye of the Beholder as an example. So, you know, we were getting there in the early days. Now, obviously, by and large, first-person won out. The vast majority of 3D games are first-person, and the vast majority of those are first-person shooters or some combination of a first-person shooter type controls. Because they're all made on Unreal Engine, which is a first-person shooter game engine. So what are you going to make if you're using Unreal? You're going to make a first-person shooter because that's what it's designed to make. Obviously, that's what the market wants. Because Call of Duty sells a bajillion copies every year for some godforsaken reason. And so everybody has to make Call of Duty clones because they want to make some money as well. And the only way to make money is to rip off the game that's selling a bajillion copies. Obviously. Isometric has more or less, outside of the examples I mentioned that are like the third-person 3D games that are kind of pseudo-isometric, that perspective has more or less died out. It never really caught on. I know, again, there are exceptions. There are some weirdo indie developers that are making retro-style games that want their game in an isometric view for whatever god-fucking reason they can come up with. Those people are weirdos. But hey, if you're a weirdo, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm kind of a weirdo myself, so no offense. But also, you know, hey, it is what it is. But we all know first person won out. Now, for a shooter or an action-style game, first person works. For a fantasy RPG type game, I mean, yeah, you do have Skyrim and Oblivion and Morrowind, which are all three basically the same game. I mean, they're all Elder Scrolls games. They're made by the same company, more or less running on variations of the same game engine. So you would expect that, it's not really a first-person shooter per se, but if you're a mage shooting fireballs, yeah, it's a shooter. Kind of like Heretic back in the old DOS days. Remember Heretic? Probably not, because it didn't sell worth a shit, because everybody was too busy buying Doom and Quake. Made by the same guys that made Doom and Quake, but nobody bought it, so you don't remember it. I remember it, but that's neither here nor there. Hexen was the sequel to Heretic. It was on the N64. You probably don't remember that game either because you were too busy playing Quake. Or GoldenEye if you were an asshole. And I'm sorry, I just called you an asshole, but I hate GoldenEye. I don't necessarily hate the people who play it, I just fucking hate that game. Let's move on. So, which one's the best? Well, even Zelda, which is not necessarily the originator of the top-down gameplay, but the one that made it popular. We can all agree on that, more or less. I mean, you could argue Pac-Man was top-down, but Pac-Man was like, not even sprites, it was just like, you know, pixels. So, that was too primitive. Everything was more or less top-down because that's all you could do. But, even Zelda has abandoned the top-down perspective, and even games like Diablo have more or less abandoned the isometric view. You can play Diablo in the isometric view. It's an option, but most people zoom out or zoom in, you know, because they don't want to, but nobody wants to play a game in that perspective because it sucks. You have no control over the camera, and the environment is just an obstacle Now, like I said, first person has essentially won out as the preferred perspective of modern 3D games, but we do still occasionally get something that is resembling an isometric view, not necessarily on video game consoles. You're not going to find too many isometric games on PlayStation or Nintendo, but you know where you are going to find them? On the PC, your MMOs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. World of Warcraft is designed to be played in a mostly isometric style view. 3D, pulled out, top-down kind of view. It's not a full top-down, and it's not necessarily true isometric, but it's as close as you're going to get. Games like Guild Wars, basically any fucking MMO. Especially RuneScape, which is 100% undeniably the isometric view, because that's the way that game was designed. And there's a possibility, I believe, that the Brighter Shores is also going to fall under that. So MMOs are still kind of holding on as residual after effects of the isometric gameplay style. And again, a lot of this goes back to the 16-bit era and the early DOS day, the 486 DOS days where RPGs were isometric. Things like Snatcher, for example, or Shining Force. A lot of them were still top-down, but then we got into Final Fantasy VII and on, and they mostly went to a, third-person 3D perspective, so, the way of Zelda, again, following Zelda. Well, Final Fantasy VII came first, but then a year later we got Ocarina of Time, etc., etc. So, which one's the best?
Mini.
I prefer the third-person perspective, not necessarily isometric, but I'm talking like Mario 64 or Jet Force Gemini or something like that. I know I just threw out another obscure game you've probably never heard of, probably never played, but it is what it is. First person sucks for RPGs. I don't care. You can talk about Skyrim all day long. Fine, but they should offer a third-person option for those of us that hate the first-person perspective. There's nothing you can do about Call of Duty. That's locked into the first-person because it's a first-person shooter. That's its genre. They're not gonna mess with the formula because then they can't sell a bajillion copies and make buttloads of money. So what are they gonna do? Just keep doing the same fucking thing that works because that's how they make their goddamn money. And the truth is, there is no best. The best is whatever works for the particular game you're playing. If Zelda works best as a top-down, great. If it works better as an isometric, okay. If it works better as a third-person 3D game, yay. Please, for the love of God, Nintendo, do not ever make a Skyrim-style Zelda that's in a first-person. Fuck all of us if that happens. Alright, again, let me know in the comments what's your preferred method of 3D, pseudo 3D gaming, and how many of these games have I mentioned have you even heard of? Stay cool.